The, so, hi everybody, good morning or good afternoon. With the daylight, it still feels like morning. And for our lecture, it is for sure very early morning as he zooms in and joins us from Minneapolis, Minnesota, the site of quite some contentious activity over the past months. At any rate, this is the fifth of our the fifth lecture in our 7-part series entitled Architectures of Speculation, where we're considering architecture's historical and contemporary relationship to real estate speculation. It is a pleasure to have Gabriel, who is a member of Berlage Generation 20, and who is an assistant professor of practice at the University of Minnesota School of Architecture. Before doing his postmaster degree at the Berlage, he studied architecture at Carnegie Mellon. In 2018, in the academic year 2018-2019, he was the Oberdick Fellow at the University of Michigan. And with Athar Mufre, he directs an architecture, well, we can call it a design and inquiry practice entitled Cadaster. So I hope everybody will appreciate the pun, where they won the very prestigious Architectural League Prize in 2018. Well, for those coming from maybe more of a North American context, that used to be called the Young Architects Award, and it's quite a significant award within the American context for emerging practices. Gabriel's work, design work and pedagogy focuses on urban transformations, territorial and preservation practices, and the role of architectural knowledge in struggles for spatial justice. He has participated in architecture exhibitions at the Canadian Centre for Architecture in Montreal, at the former NAI in Rotterdam, at the House of World Cultures, at the New School Parsons School of Design, and at the University of Michigan. Maybe before giving the floor to have Gabriel speak on can real property, which is a concept, be designed, I just want to sort of preface that I think for me, the content of today's lecture and Gabriel's work is quite inspirational, as this is something that some of these ideas he really first started to explore when he was a student, and he has found a way to kind of transpose these ideas into both a professional and pedagogical life with, complete rigor, experimentation, and sincerity, and always with great optimism and inspiration. So at any rate, the floor is yours. And thank you so much again for keeping our synchronistic moment of 12:45 p.m. Delft time, while it is 5:45 a.m. Minnesota time. So I hope you've had enough coffee to get you to pump up the adrenaline for the next hour. So thank you, Gabriel.
Thank you so much. I will share my screen now. Okay. Is it working? Do you see my presentation?
Yeah, perfect.
Okay. All right. So I'll get started. Thank you so much for the invitation. It's really an honor to join you today. The Berlage and Solomon the Berlage and Solomon have really been important influences for me, and I've also been enthusiastically following the lecture series, and I hope to be able to add something to it today in the discussion on architecture and speculation. with my thoughts on architecture, the architecture of real property. More than merely a legal or financial device, real property is a spatial material practice, one that architects must engage with in order to address the underlying forces that shape the environment. I will present 4 dimensions speaking to this. First, what is at stake? I will introduce that with a case study of property on the ground. Second, why is property a problem? I will suggest that the predominant views on property are insufficient. And then, drawing from examples of the development of property in North America, I will outline an approach for analyzing and designing through property. In the second half, which is the 4th dimension, I will discuss a couple design projects that are based on that approach. I'm referring specifically to real property, which is the property in immovable holdings, land and buildings, not personal or intellectual property. And for brevity, I will just say property, and also these interchangeable terms, which you see here: plot, tract, lot, parcel, land, all of them mean the same thing. After graduating from the Berlage, as Solomon described, I returned to the US, to Houston, Texas, and put myself to the task of studying my new surroundings. I arrived in what seemed to be a totally harmless and conventional suburb, which you can see here. However, I soon found myself spending a lot of time in this building, which is the St. John Missionary Baptist Church. This church was built 150 years ago by former slaves who were brought there by settlers in the early 1800s. The town where I was living, Sugarland, earned its name from the fact that immense amount of sugar was produced there using the labor of enslaved Africans and their descendants. Indeed, there were more than 4 million plantation slaves in the southern region of the US at the height of the US Civil War in the 1860s. When those enslaved people were freed in the aftermath of the war, an incredible transition took place. Former slaves shifted from being held as property to having the theoretical right themselves to hold property. So they transitioned into a new subjecthood, a new social role, the freed person, the freedman, which brought great volatility to the political situation in the US because landholding was synonymous with power. If freed people could come to acquire land, the whole economic system would be threatened. So what followed, and continues to this day, was a struggle by African Americans to secure basic rights, including the right to hold property. All kinds of barriers were put in place that made it very difficult for an individual freed person to acquire land. However, when freed people pooled their resources together, they had much greater success. In fact, it was primarily through collective land acquisitions that African Americans began to assert their claims to space, and church congregations like the ones shown here were key in that struggle. Exploring the rural fringe of Houston, I learned that in this region alone, there were dozens of freedmen churches, similar to the one that I had become fascinated with, and all of them had obtained their land through collective acquisition. I became good friends with one of the congregations, St. John Missionary Baptist Church, and supported them in their plans to rebuild their church, which had been set on fire about a decade earlier. So I spent Sunday mornings with them every Sunday morning, and I learned that although the church sustained a great deal of vandalism, discrimination, there was actually a deeper conflict at play, and it had to do with the land where the church was located. St. John has a particular kind of land title known as fee defeasible, which means that their claim depends on certain conditions being met. The original land title, written 150 years ago, shown on the left, stipulates that the property can be used only for church purposes, and if those ever stop, the congregation will lose its land claim. I consulted the state records and learned that most other freedmen churches face the same predicament. White landholders were willing to sell land to freed people, but only with these precarious conditions attached. In practice, what it meant that the freedmen church properties had no financial value, and they couldn't be used for anything other than for churches. These are excerpts from other title deeds for other churches that have the same type of clause. Despite these stipulations, Black churches became cultural centers for community welfare and political organizing. The historian Dylan Penningroth traced slaves' conception of property, and what he found is that with the few personal possessions that they used them to develop kinship with each other. If you extend that idea to the freedmen churches, land became the physical medium through which to cultivate social relations. What's remarkable about these congregations is that they make their land claim through practice rather than through purchase. They claim the land by gathering at the church every Sunday. So in this landscape, which you can see here, of mortgaged properties, all of this is mortgaged land, St. John is off the market, operating according to principles divergent from the investment norm. I collaborated closely with St. John. In the following years, we worked together to obtain a historic marker from the state, which brought important connections with neighbors. We went on to raise funds to rehabilitate the building, among other activities, but the history of the parcel, the history of the land, and the congregation's struggle to claim the land is what impacted me most. In 2016, we were applying for funding from a grant organization, and we needed a map of the parcel to basically prove we are the holders of the land. And I vividly remember the morning when a crew of land surveyors came to the site to chart out the location of the plot. They carefully found the corners of the property using GPS and marked them in situ with pink flags. It was fascinating, but also in a way underwhelming to watch. After 150 years of land struggle, in the end, we were going to settle the score with some flags, GPS, and a map. So I thought there had to be something more. We proceeded to collaborate to develop a design for the plot, which until then was really just a meadow of grass, which you can see here. The approach we took with the project was to emphasize the ground of the property itself by creating a walking circuit that followed the perimeter of the property boundary, shown here in green. The goal was to invite the neighbors to the plot, which is one of the very few undeveloped spaces in the neighborhood. So this green path would follow the shape of the property. And this is a collage showing the rehabilitated building and the walking path along the perimeter in the background. Somehow, during the course of this project, the familiar triad from the architecture discipline of public, private, common wasn't really helping to clarify the historical and material conditions that I found. How could I make sense of property as a spatial artifact? So studying more closely the ideologies and the processes that contributed to St. John, I understood that property maps reveal something more than merely an account of who owns what. Real property It's a spatial material institution, the purpose of which is to encode social and political values into specific organizations of land. And that process is recorded on property maps like this one. St. John set the stage for appreciating how property undergirds underlying forces in the environment in spatial, social, and political ways. First, property is a spatial framework. It involves delineating the formal land boundaries which accumulate into ever-changing territorial configurations. Property, therefore, is not only a facet of the context, it is the utmost essential space that you could construct. Second, property produces subjects with specific social roles. Where real property exists, so do subjects that reify or counterpose its conventions. And third, property mediates power. While the white landholders sought to undermine Black land claims, free people resisted with their own practices. In this light, regimes of real property do much more than facilitate the buying and selling of land. Property is an infrastructure that shapes environments, subjects, and power. So any architect interested in changing the status quo must take care to understand how property operates. Property has long been considered a problem worthy of deliberation. It has also played a central role in the ideologies of governance and social organization. Yet for all the complexity that property entails, the dominant understandings of it are surprisingly uncompromising. In short, there are two prevailing views on what to do with property, and each tries to cancel the other. The two perspectives have common ground, though. Both acknowledge property involves power, and neither is particularly helpful to engage with property from an architectural perspective. So some say abolish property at all costs. This camp tends to equate property with capitalism, and as such, property is irredeemable. Property is at odds with justice. Property is at odds with equity. But conflating property with capitalism is not quite accurate, because complex systems of property existed prior to capitalism, and even today, there are property systems that do not align with it. This is the Codex Vergara, a document produced by surveyors in the Aztec Empire in the early 1500s, illustrating the size and shape of landholdings. These accounts suggest property has been central to societies before the development of capitalism. Karl Marx also did not conflate property with capitalism, admitting that property was necessary for society. However, as you have seen in earlier talks in this series, architecture is closely tied to bourgeois private property. If we are to dismantle capitalism and property with it, what happens to architecture? Others insist the opposite, that property must proliferate without restraint because it's a prerequisite to democracy and freedom. This is the position that's always been upheld in US politics, most recently in the so-called Commission on Unalienable Rights report, which calls private property a human right. The blind spot with private property, the word private, is that private is somewhat misleading. The word private is misleading. What happens when someone's use of their property prevents another from enjoying theirs? If property is necessary for self-determination, how to ensure equal access to it? And lastly, if private landholding is here to stay, is architecture destined to reinforce the status quo of real estate? So on the ground, property somehow doesn't fit into this binary of vice versus virtue. We need a more nuanced approach if we're going to take it on. However, I think rather than architecture being defined by property in its terms, we can think of it the other way around. Use architectural design to set an agenda for property. So I will dedicate the remainder of the talk precisely to that ambition. Given the significance of property in shaping the environment, architects have relatively few tools and concepts to deal with it. The term that most often tags along with the word property is ownership. And this word is somewhat problematic because the word own does not leave much room for anyone but the owner. This is known as Blackstonian property. You own it or you do not own it. Yet, as I will show through several examples, land goes beyond owning because property is actually much more inclusive, material, relational than we give it credit for. So the concept that I think more productively recognizes the reality of property and will give architects some leverage is the interest. Interests are the possession of a share in something. Interests include all the stakes, the rights, the responsibilities that an entity can hold in land. And interests help account actually for the many ways that people are involved in property, even if they don't own it outright. This includes varying degrees of access, different kinds of stakes, multiple modes of possession, and new ways of conceiving property boundaries. So as this diagram shows, any given property has multiple overlapping interest holders. The interest represents a concept that allows architects to document, analyze, and design property's influence on space, land, and buildings. So the rest of what you will see in this talk uses the 5 concepts shown here. These are 5 protocols that operate spatially on property interests. The first, create interest, is the creation of new values. Property technology involves changing property with some external device. Articulating interest refers to reorganizing interests without changing the property line. Fragmenting interest involves the geographic separation of different parts of property, and collecting interest gathers together disparate interests for some specific purpose. So with this rubric, I will show that property is not strictly about law, finance, and governance. It's incredibly spatial and material, influencing built artifacts and territorial configurations. The creation of a class of interest, which is creating interest, generates a new geography of value superimposed onto existing legal landscapes. The creation of interest has been central in the settlement and urbanization in the US, as interests really lay the groundwork for settlement and industry, and that's what I will focus on here. You will remember the parcel of St. John, which is pointed out here. The property of the church was created as part of a settler colonial enterprise in the 1820s. The entrepreneur leading the effort produced a cadastral survey for the colony's 4 million hectares. The preemptive property infrastructure shown here created a territorial order even before the settlers arrived to the area. In fact, many early political leaders in the US were property surveyors by training. Thomas Jefferson, who was a very influential politician and surveyor, designed the grid-based property fabric that now blankets the US territory. You might be familiar with it. While very prominent, Jefferson's grid, which is called the Public Land Survey System, has always been in the company of other lesser-known spatial orders. 2 other prevalent models of organizing and constructing property were instrumental in the spatiality of colonial North America, and they're quite different from the grid. The first, which you will have read about, is indiscriminate location, which is an organic pattern of land division that had no formal preconceptions. In colonies such as Georgia, settlers were allocated a certain size of land, and then they were free to fashion it regardless of any kind of formal regularity. Settlers really preferred this do-it-yourself geometry over prescribed rectilinear shapes. But of course, real estate agents had a great amount of difficulty locating, measuring, and selling such irregular parcels. The other spatial order contemporary to the grid was the long lot, which was the favored model of French colonists. Settlements were organized as long, thin parcels arrayed perpendicular to the course of major rivers, and each parcel had a defined dimension at the waterfront, but the opposite end, the far end of the parcel was often not surveyed. So French colonial order aimed at dominion over the waterways, but it was relatively ambivalent to any kind of continental scale domination. Returning to Texas, which is a place that has certainly led the way in the innovation of property. This is the late 1800s. The state created, maybe for the first time, a three-dimensional property regime, which they called severance, because it severed the surface from the subsurface. This allowed speculators to sell the mineral rights to oil and gas deep below the surface of the land. Three-dimensional property interests proliferated in cities as well. The Cleveland Athletic Club entered into a 98-year lease for a volume of air above an adjacent building, which allowed the club to build on top of it, which you can see in this image. The 5-story red brick building is the adjacent building above which the air was leased. The property boundary in this case passed through the top of the steel girders above the 5th floor of the existing building. A few years later, again in Texas, we can observe an early form of master planned property subdivision near the St. John Church. The landholder drew up a speculative boomtown, hoping to attract investment during an oil boom. Foreshadowing, however, the pressure that real estate would have, the church, which should appear on the left edge of the boomtown, is notably absent from the master plan. These boomtowns prefigured what we now call subdivision, the process of creating multiple smaller parcels from a larger one. Within these territories, speculators mass produce buildings that unfailingly fall within property lines. Images of contemporary suburbanization, like this one, show that the property infrastructure, much like the early colonial enterprise in the 1800s, reveals how the lot lines dictate the eventual and maybe even incidental nature of buildings that come afterward. Technologies of property are external disruptions that cause a land regime to change. They indirectly reconfigure property dynamics. From New York to Chicago, Kansas City, Denver, and San Francisco, one finds the same urban parcel measuring approximately 20 feet in width and 100 feet in depth. The origin of this 20-foot dimension lies in the fact that the timber industry making wood products produced products of very standardized dimensions. The largest of the commercially available members for a floor structure was a 3-inch by 12-inch pine wood floor joist that was structurally capable of spanning 20 feet, according to architectural standards of the late 1800s. The 3 by 12 floor joist, which is shown on the right, was used pervasively in urban building construction, establishing the basic interval for territory in the United States. Spanning from property line to property line, the 3 by 12 floor joist facilitated the multiplication of square footages and the country's preoccupation with real estate. Last spring, I managed to locate one of these structural members from an antique dealer in Detroit. and installed it in a gallery. So the width of this typical parcel was in fact subject of intense architectural debate. It seems, arbitrary, 20 feet, what does it matter? Architect Edward Tuckerman Potter wrote several articles in an architectural journal arguing that this typical dimensional width of a parcel, particularly in New York, shouldn't be left to non-architectural forces, to considerations beyond architects' purview. He produced a number of diagrams, including this one, trying to illustrate his point, which is that if you change the spacing of property lines, drastically different buildings will emerge. The articulation of interest involves rescripting property with new legal or social qualifications. This protocol is especially helpful to account, for example, for ecological measures. Numerous jurisdictions in the US now are implementing zoning requirements, kind of planning requirements, for example, to create habitat conditions for bees. In such cases, parcels of land are obliged to have a portion of their land surface dedicated to native plantings that are beneficial to the insects. Fragmentation of property involves a scattering of interests, either legal or geographic scattering. The fragment interest protocol is not one that has been used often, but its impact has been very significant. This is most evident in the colonial territory that the US government has designed to delimit and undermine native people. The image shown here depicts the area set aside for the Leech Lake Band of Ojibwe, an indigenous tribe in the north of the US. The tribe is the primary interest holder for only 5% of the reservation's 250,000 land hectares. This is complicated by the fact that those interests are entirely scattered. This produces a landscape of fragmented interests shown here, making the use of the land virtually impossible for them. The collection of property interests involves the physical aggregation of different parcels or interests. In the early 1900s, the US Congress passed a law that limited building heights in the city of Washington, D.C. to 30 meters. The purpose of the law was to ensure that the many political monuments which exist in the city would remain visible landmarks. If you keep the buildings low, they can ensure that the White House and the Capitol and everything are constantly visible. But the law was not strictly about vision and urban planning, because it also caused a significant change in the real estate dynamics of the city. By limiting the height of buildings, by saying you can only build so high, developers could no longer achieve an economy of scale by building tall buildings. Faced with the small-scale property fabric and a cap on the height of the building, developers had to shift to another scale operation. They bought entire city blocks, collecting dozens of 20-foot wide parcels into massive singular properties. This, of course, changed the nature of the architectural commission. Architects needed to design massive structures that would meet the financial models of real estate developers. So using the interest and its protocols, these 5 protocols, as an analytical tool, we can see that property is not strictly about finance. It's more than governance and law in the abstract, although of course those factors are very important. Property has had a significant impact on territorial configurations and even individual buildings. You can look at one single building and see how property has been impacting it. And I think that property, the global fabric of property, has arguably determined some of the basic categories even through which we understand architecture. Consider, for example, the client, the site, and the envelope, basic architectural categories. Without a commissioning landowner, for whom would an architect work? Without a guaranteed patch of land, where would architecture situate itself? If there were no property lines, where would architecture stop? Indeed, what would architecture be without these categories, which originate in great part in the medium of real property? For the next half of the talk, I will present two projects that respond to and work with property. In these projects, the approach we have assumed is that property is a system. It's structured by rules, processes, dynamics. And if we want to design through property, we have to work through those same channels. Our ambition, therefore, was to create ways of designing indirectly, to influence many buildings at once and the broader territory, rather than composing individual artifacts. In all cases, we have been using design as a way to change the relations that property mediates with society, ecology, and politics. This project consists, the interval of territory, this project consists of several hypothetical design scenarios that address the spatial, ecological, legal realities of property. Each scenario operates through one of the 5 property interest protocols that I described. I will present designs for 3 of the protocols: creating interest, property technology, and collecting interest. Our hypothesis in these hypothetical design scenarios was, if property influences in great part the systemic inequities around us, by designing through property, we might be able to access the forces that sustain them in a way to expand agency potentially. Accordingly, the design scenarios are addressing issues such as greenhouse gas emissions, housing affordability, land finance, and civic rights. In this scenario, we use the create interest protocol to propose a new layer of interests based on carbon and biomass as a way to introduce new ecological dynamics. In 2010, the Chicago Climate Exchange, at the time North America's only carbon emissions trading platform, closed due to inactivity. Despite the failure of the Chicago carbon market, in 2019, the governor signed an executive order committing to the Paris Agreement. California, another state with carbon emissions trading, currently leads the way with its cap and trade platform. However, California's carbon platform is used primarily by landholders of vast forested areas outside of cities. What if cities recognized a new kind of property interest, carbon property? Perhaps it has the potential to create new value in biomass, encourage cooperation, and reduce emissions. This scenario uses LiDAR data to remotely sense biomass, such as the trees shown here. So first, after the official valuation of biomass is instituted, a group of residents registers the first carbon tract. By co-owning it, they reduce their individual costs to register and verify it. Next, on another tract, neighbors remove their car garages and grow trees on their combined yards, creating a larger carbon reduction. More substantially, observing the increased value of neighboring carbon properties over time, an even larger group of residents registers one large carbon tract covering half a city block. They deconstruct their houses, donate the materials, and build a new apartment building for themselves. The remainder of their land is cultivated as a forest, raising the function and value of their co-owned carbon property. Other landholders and tenants organize to register carbon properties, facilitating cooperative climate action and physical transformation across the city. The collect interest protocol, in this case, we propose to use collective property to organize new housing opportunities. The city of San Francisco has undergone a housing shortage since the 1990s, and today the median price for a house there is about $1 million. While the city has gained 400,000 new jobs, it permitted only 50,000 new housing units in the past 5 years. Accessory dwelling units are now permitted throughout the city, allowing single housing units to be built in the backyard of existing houses. But the development of those housing units really depends on the initiative of an individual landholder and the inflexible property structure. And as you can see, vast portions of the blocks are actually unbuilt. San Francisco's typical block consists of 56 properties. And the current policy accommodates an accessory housing unit on these individual parcels, but each of the parcels is individually constrained by the zoning law. What if residents merged their parcels, sharing land and resources to expand the affordable housing stock? So several neighbors join their properties to form a cooperative plot. The cooperative then builds new housing, and with the economy of scale, they have higher collective equity and reduced construction costs. Next, by combining properties together back to back on both sides of the block, the zoning requirement for a rear building setback is avoided, opening the block to new building configurations. Even further, a whole block cooperative can be assembled, collectively maintaining courtyard space and providing more diverse living and work options. Because it lacks street frontage, housing and office space in the courtyard can be marketed at reduced rates. So new urban forms and property arrangements reinvent the typical city block of San Francisco, making conditions for more neighbors. Property technology. This scenario, which is the last of the three I'll show, uses a special kind of taxation to change a city's real estate dynamics. For millennia, authorities have promoted and recorded land in order to collect taxes on property. While governments today impose a range of taxes, there's one source, tremendous source of economic value that is not taxed, the value of location, also known as land value. 19th century American economist Henry George argued that the value of location derives from public investment and the activities of society at large, rather than the individual actions of any landholder. George proposed to tax the value of location and eliminate all other taxes. What if a land value tax was implemented today? Such a tax might impact the dynamics of land and buildings because it would increase the cost of holding land in locations with high value. First, a land value tax would be instituted in the city. This would create an increased tax burden on properties in the central business district of a city that have high value. The existing buildings are shown here, and the key map at the top of the video shows the relative tax burden of each parcel on the block. Responding to this new tax, some landholders erect new rental buildings in order to maximize economic rent and more easily pay this tax. Other landholders attempt to reduce their tax burden by reducing the size of their property, dedicating portions of it to the public domain, shown in yellow. Next, a parcel that cuts through the block is created, preserving pedestrian access to the block's interior. The remaining landholders split their lots, creating residential parcels in the middle of the block that are more affordable because of their small size and lack of street frontage. Soon after, real estate developers construct mixed-use buildings on the parcels that remain, maximizing their income on these heavily taxed lots. As a result, the land value tax influences a range of architectural outcomes, producing a more efficient and equitable use of land in prime locations. I will turn now to our most recent project, which is concerned with the opposite end of the spectrum of real estate development. I have shown a lot the real estate development that is done by commercial developers, with high amounts of capital and a lot of professional expertise. This project, on the other hand, is focused on resident-led coalitions, development that is done by the residents themselves, so to speak, as opposed to commercial developers, and the spatial implications that those have. The particular model that we're exploring is the community land trust, or CLT, which is the most prevalent resident-led landholding practice in the US. We are studying specifically how the spatial distribution of a community land trust and its properties impact its ability to meet its goals, which oftentimes are tied to the advancement of social justice. So I will say CLT a lot, and when I say CLT, I mean community land trust, just so you keep that in mind. The premise of the CLT relies on the articulate interest protocol. The interest to the ground is held by a nonprofit organization who holds the land in trust for a particular community and its future residents, while the interest to the use of the plot is held by a leaseholder who agrees to a long-term rental. At the end of the lease, the land's market appreciation value is retained by the trust rather than being captured by the leaseholder. That's how CLTs operate. But they make an impact more than just in financial terms, because they also act spatially. What is most striking from a spatial point of view is that virtually all of the community land trusts are scattered. In other words, the properties in the trust are dispersed over a wide area. And the reasons for this are various, which I will explain. What's shown here is 6 different community land trusts in 6 different cities, abstracted from their geographic context and overlaid on top of each other at the same scale. So you can see how in different cities, different trusts are organized in different ways. But in general, they're all very scattered. Unlike commercial developers that have the capital to afford long-term risky strategies, land trusts, which are resident-led, have to negotiate the social financial dynamics of the property fabric with funding that comes on an annual cycle from grants. The spatial scattering is also the consequence from the diverse ways that these trusts acquire land. In some cases, it has to do with a program that is aimed at existing residents who want to renovate their houses. They get a grant, and in exchange, the trust takes hold of the ground interest. In other cases, land is donated to the trust. Sometimes the trust will help with mortgage foreclosures of somebody who cannot continue to pay for their mortgage. And in return, again, it goes to the trust. Sometimes they make agreements with developers, and sometimes they buy land outright like everybody else on the market. This map illustrates the spatial implication of two different community land trusts in the same city, Minneapolis, where I am. One focuses on what they call economic integration, which is the one shown in magenta. And the economic integration ethos basically involves that the residents are distanced from each other as much as possible, such that they're not detectable in the host community, so that they're not stigmatized for participating in the trust program, which is, of course, a kind of affordable housing program. The other land trust, which is shown in blue, has another ethos, which is that of neighborhood revitalization. And that demands, on the other hand, a tight clustering of properties that aims to financially stabilize a neighborhood undergoing gentrification. So with these two divergent examples, you can see how a trust mission, whether it's more liberal or more interested in a political agenda, has direct spatial implications. Virtually every community land trust in the US consists of at least two properties in its trust. I don't know of any trust that is one single property. So because there are at least two properties, there's always a spatial relationship between those two properties and between those properties and their surroundings. So the question that we're asking in this project is, to what extent can trusts strategically design the pattern of their land holdings? What consequences do scattered patterns produce in the urban field? And how can the spatial ordering of these trusts become part of designers' spatial practice? To help with these questions, we have proposed the concept virtues of proximity, which are the benefits gained from strategic dispersion. Virtues of proximity bring proximate properties into a larger scheme of agency and operation, relying on a coordinated position, coordinated distance, coordinated relation with the surrounding urban field. And unlike economies of scale, virtues of proximity may lead to a variety of different benefits and objectives, not simply cost savings. Studying the property formations of CLTs in the US, we began to see a pattern. There are essentially three scattering formations: the cluster, the constellation, and consolidation, which can help understand how these patterns are not simply contingent realities, the result of arbitrary processes, but actually purposeful strategic designs. And each organizes land holdings in a different way. So I will present case studies for all three of these patterns, and also some design schemes that attempt to create these virtues of proximity. Here's a case study for the cluster. The Vine City neighborhood in Atlanta has been subject to countless plans and projects. However, these have created relatively few benefits for the mainly African-American residents. The neighborhood is partially located in a river valley that was buried as part of the city's urbanization. Due to their elevation, several blocks of the neighborhood are in the floodplain and houses have been deteriorating. The Westside Atlanta Land Trust has intervened here since 2015 to organize its scattered land holdings to relocate residents from low elevations to a cluster of higher ground parcels in directly adjacent areas. Constellation. Constellations, I should have mentioned with the cluster, the objective with the cluster is to have a critical mass of parcels in a given geographic area. Constellation, on the other hand, is not about any sort of critical mass or proximity, but carefully situating the parcels in relation to a larger urban structure, such as the case here in again in Atlanta with the Beltline Land Trust. The Atlanta Beltline is a citywide revitalization that is converting an old railroad into a large-scale recreational corridor encircling the city. So it's a kind of massive urban structure which takes the form of a line passing through the city. As part of the new linear park, which is going to pass through the city, Atlanta is establishing a special tax district. Within the district, the city is incentivizing real estate development and building new parks. It's estimated that land sales and property taxes will increase up to 1 kilometer from the trail as a result of this investment. Community land trust parcels near this tax district will provide residents stability in their neighborhoods and access to the Beltline's new trails and parks. As property taxes increase, a CLT in a constellation pattern along this infrastructure helps to keep prices affordable for the existing residents. Consolidation, the formation of consolidation is deploying directly adjacent lots right next to each other to develop some kind of activity across property lines. This is the city of Tampa in Florida in the US. The Bright Community Land Trust has over 170 parcels dispersed over the Tampa metropolitan region. And the trust focuses on affordable housing in a variety of different building types. So when you view the trust at the scale of the city, you can see that the trusts are really, the trust properties are scattered. But when you zoom in more closely, you can see that many of the trust lots are actually directly situated right next to each other. Several of the CLT's land holdings are actually organized around community amenities. For example, this grouping of CLT lots is consolidated around an existing community center that offers recreational and social programs. So the trust benefits from this amenity and at the same time extends its patronage to the community center. So observing how these trusts have deployed their scattering in intelligent ways, we think that architects can also be involved in supporting these resident-led models. More specifically, though, the task might be not only to design or renovate buildings with the land trust, but to contribute to the design of scattered property formations to kind of contend with the reality of the urban field. To that end, I will show a couple designs that employ this kind of coordinated spatial action, first using the cluster pattern and then the consolidation pattern. In US cities, commercial developers buy out several adjacent properties and merge them, creating larger parcels for bigger developments. This provides higher density, but often contributes to the displacement of existing residents. Could a CLT coordinate its land holdings in a way to control real estate projects? CLT properties cannot be sold, and their use is controlled by a community board. Using a clustered checkerboard pattern, CLTs could disrupt commercial development. Not able to achieve an economy of scale with land mergers, real estate developers will go elsewhere. The CLT thus contributes to preserving the neighborhood. Many Black and brown communities in the US contend with food insecurity due to the lack of supermarkets and space for agriculture. Could a CLT help resolve this conflict by coordinating property for urban agriculture? Farmers need an economy of scale, but in a city, there aren't any large plots available. A CLT then might assemble partial interests into a larger interconnected consolidated surface. This would provide urban farmers the economy of scale they need. Landholders who dedicate a portion of their parcel directly adjacent to where another landholder has done the same will receive a share of the harvest. As the land interests consolidate, everyone gets a bonus. In conclusion, more than merely a legal or financial device, real property is a spatial material practice that architects must engage with in order to address the underlying forces of the environment. But the history of property shows that spatial practice cannot concern itself exclusively with the design of individual buildings or public spaces. The spatial ordering of property in the US and in the world in general shows that the qualification of the ground must be seen itself as a form of design. Qualifying the ground is a design. Spatial practitioners face several questions, therefore. How to design a system of spatial order rather than compose pre-existing outputs? What are the power relations that charge any given plot? What new subjects can emerge in the wake of the landowner? Such questions are critical, even if they initially reveal the extent to which architects' current agency is circumscribed by real estate principles. The institution of property might seem untouchable by architectural agency, something that we cannot impact. However, with the property interest and the incredible insights already presented in this series of talks, we might have some clues. We must consider land infrastructure through its various dimensions: property lines, property maps, deeds, laws, rights and obligations, material and financial circulations, lot geometries, earthly life, etc. Only through such stock-taking can spatial practitioners, in action with the participants of the property institution, aim toward new spatial orders that uphold property as a practice, such as those enacted by the freedmen churches over the past century and a half. As long as architecture remains bound to land, spatial practice must contend with the institution that governs it. Thank you.
Thank you, Gabriel, for conceptualizing real property and thinking with us the agency of design. I believe there are some questions. If we can open this up to the audience.
Yeah, I would love to.
Yeah. I have a question. Hello, Gabriel. Thank you for the lecture. Well, I was wondering, in the community land trust, is there a pattern for the time for the rental agreement? Is that pattern of the lease contract, does it have a relation to the lifespan of the building? Or how can you preserve a solid community board if they are, that can prevent later the selling of those plots?
Thank you for your question. The community land trust has a kind of critical document that it operates with. It's a legal document, which is they have a term for it. I can't quite think of it right now, but it's the document that stipulates what happens when the leaseholder wants to sell their lease. And they have a series of stipulations that basically accounts for the future interest of someone who will come after them. So when someone obtains a lease for a community land trust property, they kind of forfeit their right to capture the appreciation of the land value over time. But in return, they are able to acquire land at a much lower price than if they were to do so on the market. So it's a kind of exchange with some future individual And that's somehow the kind of solidarity that is expressed in the community land trust, that you are agreeing to some kind of land concept, some idea of what land is and how it's used, in order to preserve the ability of some future entity to do the same. And that's basically how it's organized. That said, a lot of, I mean, there are right now, most of the CLTs are based on housing, and within that, the great majority are single family houses, which, as you might know, is the predominant form of housing in the United States. And I think it has some complications. If CLTs continue to kind of proliferate single family houses, there have been numerous papers written recently about this, whether a CLT is actually reinforcing kind of existing norms about land ownership and housing by just having single family houses, more and more single family houses, or if the community land trust has a more radical political potential. And so with the designs that we were developing, we were looking almost, even if the CLT was completely apolitical, if they had no political interest whatsoever, their disposition in the urban field will still produce some kind of impact, will still produce some kind of effect. So there's multiple ways that we're looking at it. And as I mentioned, this community land trust have a kind of specific set of documents that they adhere to in order to make legal documents in order to uphold the principles that's behind the model.
Hi, I've got a question. So I actually grew up in the Twin Cities, so I have.
Oh wow!
Yes, I have
Cool.
2 questions. The first one's pretty simple. Just curious, has it snowed there yet? Since it's after Thanksgiving.
Good question. It actually snowed like a month and a half ago. We had a foot of snow a month and a half ago.
Sounds about right, but that's
Yes.
pretty early. Okay, and then
Yes, early.
and then so I wanted to talk about the kind of the Chicago Lake area, which is the kind of southern part of that blue cluster that you showed. So right now there's a lot of infrastructure planned and has been built around that area, like the Greenway and then the light rail.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there's been any like increase in CLTs in response or in anticipation of those, because those are kind of, I guess, I don't know, agents or like methods of gentrification, I guess.
Yeah. That's a really great question, and I appreciate, I'm happy to hear your familiarity with the area and you know, seeing it on the map and understanding it. That's really great. So yeah, there has been a huge, I would say, increase in interest in the community land trust, especially you know, since June, in that area. And I know there are a number of social movements and activists working towards that end. I think though that the community land trust is not, although we are very fascinated with it and it has a lot of potential, I don't think it's necessarily like the ultimate solution, that it takes care of every urban contingency. It's but at the same time, it really has the potential to, institute new values about how land is conceived. And even as I tried to demonstrate with the scattering and the different CLTs, how they strategize their kind of urban action, a CLT can really, I think, as what you're suggesting, take on a kind of development role, or like to do real estate, to do development without real estate, or to do development without developers. That really kind of switches the agency and the burden to residents to organize. And so, yeah, there are I think a great amount of interest in that, and I expect in the near future we'll see community land trust probably emerging in that area.
Yeah, thank you.
Thanks for your question.
Yeah.
Hi, thank you for the lecture. In the beginning, you discussed the African American church and kind of the unwantedness based on the vandalism. And you go into this economic integration where you're placing individuals from a different community within a different community, but they're kind of hidden. So I was kind of curious if you could expand on integrating different communities together, because it seemed quite one specific community orientation, and especially with minorities and the native indigenous population has such a different view on land, how these kind of minorities can be integrated more.
Thank you so much. That's a really great question. In the case of, I'm trying to think how to respond. In the case of the African American churches, it's true in a sense. It was a kind of self-standing, independent kind of society and culture and group of people who were associated with that cultural landscape, which was a rural landscape of freedmen churches with, you know, relatively small amounts of people. What happened in Houston and across the South is suburbanization, where the city is now extended so far into the frontier that these churches, which used to be in the middle of a cotton field, are now surrounded by these new suburban developments. And that was, honestly, that was one of the most, that was the main question in a sense, working with the church, which is, okay, the church served its kind of social function up until now as a Black church, which is very multifaceted. So what happens now with the church in this new context? And that premise was behind the idea of opening the parcel with this new walking circuit, among other kind of small scale surface interventions in the site. Because the church really sees itself in that way, that they see themselves as kind of a community support function. They have very much the interest and the desire to host or facilitate new neighborly interactions in the suburb. And I can say from the part of the neighbors, a lot of people, they just drive past the building and they assume that it's abandoned. They don't even know that it's something's going on there. And that's, you know, in part from the developer mindset in the municipalities of these areas, because the municipalities are like entirely financed by real estate taxes, and they're so like for real estate development. They just let the real estate developers do whatever they want. And as a result, all of these traces of this history, you know, the cotton, the sugar cane, all of this stuff is just kind of erased or submerged into the ground. It's amazing that the churches are still there and can kind of attest to the history. In regards to the community land trust and economic integration, I mean, you might have picked up that we're somewhat critical to this idea of economic integration. It's in a way, it's complex, I would say. It's a dilemma, because on one hand, yeah, it makes sense to provide access to land for people who normally have been excluded from the institution. But what are the terms then through which those marginalized identities become included in the institution? And that's somehow problematic, I think, because if the idea is that all the marginalized identities who have been excluded from land now can enter land, but only in the kind of terms and the convention of the existing system, then it's kind of just, it's a sort of false inclusion or a sort of pessimistic inclusion where the modes of understanding property are kind of erased. But in order to kind of enter into the system, you kind of have to purge your practices and your politics and adopt what these different models are organized. And so it's certainly a dilemma. And I think that that's the challenge somehow of the community land trust, to not devolve into a kind of it's called the nonprofit industrial complex. It's a huge system of just grant financing and all these procedures that sort of are evacuated of any kind of radical political ambition. So, great question. It's very much a consideration in our part, and I know the part of many others as well.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? Philip, do you have something to ask Gabriel? You're on mute.
So Ludo raised his hand, but I have also a question. In the beginning, you mentioned severance in relationship to, let's say, air rights and mineral rights. I was just wondering, I don't know, I guess it's not specific to Texas, but is that a blanket, let's say, a blanket condition of every plot of land, or would that be stipulated in function of certain plots? Or is owning property in Texas that per definition mean that you don't own under, let's say, a certain amount of feet, or is it specifically stipulated for certain plots? Do you know that?
Yes, that's a very good question. I cannot say for certain, but I suspect from what I have seen, if an area doesn't have oil, there's almost no need for the subsurface right. So
yeah, I was thinking maybe that was the reason actually why I was asking to what extent, because I can imagine it impacts water rights and these kind of things as well, which might be relevant in certain areas.
Yes, absolutely. And what you're raising is actually kind of what we're trying to get after with conceptualizing property as an interest, because if you have the interest to the land, someone else has interest to the minerals, but as someone over here who is drinking the water that comes from over here, in a sense, you also have an interest to here. So the interests are not strictly stacking. They kind of also are geographically dispersed and interconnected to each other. And I think, yeah, somehow the idea behind conceptualizing it this way is to like make property see property more for its relations, the relations that it creates. And it has to do with, material, water and oil and things that are kind of, they cannot be partitioned to particular plots of land. They kind of are spread out and contingent on a lot of different factors.
Right.
But go ahead.
No, thanks.
You could also observe that with like mining. I know in the Western states, the mineral rights also apply to mining for gold and other things. But of course, as you suggested, where there is no mineral underground, there's the idea of severance is not relevant. For Texas, I've been trying so hard to get more info about severance, but I haven't been able to find it. I think we have to take a trip to some courthouses in Texas, Philip, and get to the bottom of it. They're inventing now a new interest in wind, like wind as a property interest, which is kind of the next level of Texas energy property. We should explore that.
Yeah, and because I think it might have sort of unforeseen consequences, in a sense that since those provisions are not always used, maybe even what they are intended for, like, or what you would expect would be the, why they made sense. I mean, even historically, because you mentioned the historical examples of the, let's say, of the Land Ordinance Act and the kind of what was even attached to the original plots, that, I mean, that was a kind of individual settler-based system, which then got sort of from the start appropriated and kind of sort of, in a certain sense, illegally conglomerated in order to make larger holdings in function of then mineral rights. So because of, the kind of relatively generic understanding of what that territory was, so that even in the initial sort of distributive act of the Land Ordinance of Jefferson, let's say, and the later incarnations or the later revisions of that system and let's say the land grants, etc.
Right.
That there was a kind of sort of intrinsic possibility for abuse already within, which tied to a more three-dimensional understanding of the, kind of combining the terrain. Thank you.
Thank you.
Ludo, did you have a question?
Yeah, I think this was a great example. Thank you, Gabriel, for your lecture. I think it was a great example, first of all, how to use the, let's say, the tools and the digital models to convey such kind of complex ideas as you outlined today. So thanks a lot for that. I think it's great examples for the students. And following up on that, I wondered, do you see, or can you speculate upon, let's say, some of these models you're introducing at the moment they might be not so feasible because the complex bureaucratic and, let's say, paper-based structures behind it that would be needed for them, at least some of them. And I wondered if you would speculate how, let's say, more digital forms of, let's say, how these property rights are stipulated, how that in the future could kind of allow for these concepts that you introduced to happen, and what would be those kind of necessary digital tools that we could, let's say, allow more flexible property rights and structures.
Thank you, Ludo. That's a really great inquiry. I'm happy to hear that the labor that has gone into the digital techniques somehow is legible, and yeah, using the video and data and so on to kind of construct these scenarios, which is based on actual data somehow. I mean, we can debate whether the data is real, but it's sort of publicly available data that is downloadable and accessible by anybody who wants to reach it. The question of digital property is so crucial now. I think what I have seen is that the more, let's say, capitalist camp of property, the one that's interested in proliferating it without restraint, is absolutely exploiting digital technology to increase the circulation of property, to increase the amount of participants in it. There are now crowdsourced, digitally mediated property investment apps. So you can kind of digitally break down a building or a property into digital shares that people can buy and trade on apps. So certainly computation has helped in kind of accelerating the circulation of property. And there are also companies emerging now, which are called prop tech. It's a kind of new I don't know what you would call it, like startup industry called prop tech, which is completely dedicated to technology for property. Some of it's very banal, like how do you, I mean, maybe it's not banal, like how do you control the radiators in the building with a digital system in order for the manager of a building to save money and in its maintenance. There are other more complicated property tech, prop tech endeavors now. In New York, there's one called Envelope, which is actually started by architects. Incredibly sophisticated computational platform that is making an inventory and of all of the air rights in New York City, which I guess the air rights in New York City somehow have a total value of, I don't know, multiple tens of billions of dollars, like an extreme amount of value in air rights that is being computationally inventoried and kind of put into different scenarios through prop tech software. So absolutely, like there's this interest to kind of commercialize technology for property. What I have yet to see, and I guess this is our interest, is to use computation in digital technology and big data for a kind of other political ambition, one which tries to give agency and platform for the people who aren't commercial real estate developers. And I think, I mean, part of that, I do have one example, which is actually one of the land trusts I showed, the one in Tampa. I understand they're building now a kind of GIS scenario system, because every year they get, let's say, I don't know, $2 million in grant funds. So they kind of they're developing this platform, which is fed by public GIS data and economic data, a platform to say, okay, with our $2 million grant funds that we have this year, what are the different locations where we can obtain land? What are the different interests available in different parts, or the different economic incentives that would allow us to achieve certain ambitions? Let's say we want 200 multifamily units here, and so on. So I guess the question there too is like, how do you prevent it from not devolving into about a question of efficiencies and economic efficiency, which is really kind of market-based rather than more a political basis. So wonderful question. And yes, we'll keep exploring, and we can talk again about it soon.
Thanks.
Thank you. If there are no more questions, I think we'd like to thank Gabriel for the talk. I would be curious to know, maybe as a kind of final remark, where you see other possibilities for this research to continue, or what other avenues what other kinds of case studies do you see in its progression?
Good question, Solomon. I guess I have to speculate. I think, yeah, I would say one continued interest that I think has still to be further developed is where's the design creativity in this somehow as a designer? I mean, as an architect, you can of course act in a political way by organizing with social activism and trying to change laws and so on, which is extremely important. But then there's also somehow like, what is the potential of design creativity and like architectural imagination? And that's really the thing that somehow we're most concerned with, and I think still developing. It's still a process, and it's I think as like connecting to what Ludo said, connecting to how to use the resources we have as architects in a way that can somehow contend with property and its very complex network of stakes through design, with design. And I would say that's the main area to go.
That's a great answer. Thank you so much for that. So thank you everybody for attending, and we will see you in 2 weeks' time when we'll have the lecture by Forbes Massey. Thanks. The